I became Muslim when I was about 18, and I subsequently went to the Muslim world and studied for several years Islamic religion, the legal system, and theology. And I returned to the West and founded an institution in California, which is dedicated to disseminating Islamic tradition amongst Muslims in the West, and also attempting to create a viable way of being Muslim in the West so that there's not so much conflict. The idea in Islamic legal tradition, the idea of a father or the parents arranging a marriage for a male or a female traditionally, was actually considered acceptable by many of the legal scholars of Islam. It's a practice that we find almost in every single pre-modern civilization, including the Chinese, the Indian, the Hindu culture still does this. It's practiced in Africa, and it was practiced certainly in the West. We have many, many examples of that. So this is a pre-modern way of bringing people together, and oftentimes it was actually very successful, and other times it was not. And it's well known in the Islamic tradition, a woman actually told the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, that she was being told to marry somebody by her parents that she did not want to marry, and he told her, if you don't want to marry the man, then you shouldn't marry the man. And she said to him, actually, I do want to marry him, but I wanted to show the women that they had rights. And that is a sound tradition. The idea traditionally was that parents know best for their children, and obviously they would only want the best for their children, and that is often the motivating factor behind it. But there are also very strong opinions, for instance in my school, which is the Maliki school, that a woman should not be harmed, that she has a right to be in a situation in which she is entirely safe. She should certainly be in no physical threat, ever. And the idea that somehow Islam promotes or accepts domestic violence is completely contradictory to every legal understanding in Islamic history. In my school, again, it is actually prohibited to beat a child, to lay a hand on a child, and certainly before 7 to use any type of punitive discipline, because the child does not have discrimination. I mean, a child cannot lie. In Islamic legal theory, until a child reaches puberty, they're not morally accountable for their actions. And so I think it's really important for people, especially in the United Kingdom, to recognize that in Islamic tradition, a person must absolutely adhere to the laws of the land. My own teacher, who's one of the great legal authorities of this time, Shaykh Abdullah bin Bayya, he gave us a legal opinion, a fatwa, that Muslims living in the West should absolutely not force any of their daughters into marriages that they do not want to go into. And I personally think that that is actually very much within the spirit of the Islamic tradition, and it's certainly much more in the spirit of the time that we're living in and the level of education that many of our young women are now obtaining. We're not in a pre-modern environment or society, and yet unfortunately we do have some pre-modern mentalities out there. And I really think that many of these parents do believe they're doing the best for their daughters, but we have, I think, too much evidence now within the social services of the damage that many of these marriages are doing to these young women. We're getting eating disorders, we're getting suicidal tendencies. I mean, and I think these need to be taken very seriously. And so I feel that especially the young girls that are being put into these situations, they should recognize that within their own religion they do have a spectrum of possibility, and they're not being un-Islamic if they feel that this is unacceptable. I think that they do have a right, and I don't believe it's just simply a human right as we would term it in the West, but I would believe it's actually a divine right. it's a right from God that their dignity is maintained.
What does the Quran say about forced marriage? Because there's been some talk that a forced marriage is void. Is that your understanding?
Well, there's no verse in the Quran that permits forced marriage. There's no verse in the Quran that says that you have to do this or that. But there is a verse that you should obey your parents as long as they do not tell you to do something that is disobedient to God. And traditionally, I think that is one of the verses that was used to say that if the parents want you to marry somebody, that you should obey them. And I think that, again, in pre-modern worlds, this was certainly just the way people did things. I mean, this is why in the West, girls would marry the men that were chosen for them. Arranged marriages in British society were very common, especially in the aristocracy. I mean, it was very common. You simply married to bring two families together, often to bring wealth together. So these were the ways things were done, and people did not question or challenge them. I don't think that's the case any longer. And I do think, again, that is certainly a valid Islamic position. In other words, the modern Western understanding that a woman should not be forced into a marriage is a valid tradition within the Islamic legal system, and it's certainly the one that is compatible with Western legal theory today, and it's the one I believe that we should be adopting and following in the West, and I think that's very important. I converted to Islam. I'm a Western person. I can't deny my experience, my background, and my understandings. I bring those into Islam with me, just like every other people in the history of Islam who came into Islam brought with them their cultures, their traditions. So Islam embraces culture and says, bring your culture with you, but if, for instance, your culture is one in which premarital sex is acceptable, then you can't bring that in, because Islam says you cannot have any relations, sexual relations, before marriage. So there are limits to that, obviously, but generally cultures and various and diverse cultures are welcome. The Quran celebrates diversity.
Talking of those traditions, a lot of the conflict comes for some of the young girls with the hijab. What would you say to a young girl who doesn't want to wear it?
Well, I would say, I mean, for me, it's very difficult to find any acceptable position about the headscarf. That's what I was taught, and that's what I've consistently seen both in the Quran and in the Hadith tradition. So I really do believe that is part of the Islamic tradition. But I would say that I've met many very devout Muslim women that do not cover their heads, and I certainly know that faith in God, belief in God, love of the Prophet are found in the hearts of many women that do not cover their heads. So I would say that it's very important, not to demonize these girls, not to say that you're bad or that you're going to hell. And I think that in the West, most of these young girls, they're more British than they are Asian. Many of their peers have been British girls, and that's not their culture. And I think this is where a lot of the crisis is coming, is that the children have a different culture than the parents. And so we're dealing with a clash of cultures, in a sense. And I think what we need to recognize is that the cultures are not necessarily always antagonistic. I mean, there's certain things within the British culture that are very conflictual with Islam, but also with Christianity. I think there are many Christians that are distressed by a lot of the aspects of, decadent Western culture. So I don't really think that that's, the Muslims are the only ones that are troubled about certain aspects of Western society and civilization. But I think there's also many things that are very good and very positive, and I don't find any incompatibility with those things and with Islam. And that's where we need to really differentiate. Is this culture or is this Islam? And I think that many Muslims are often shocked to find how broad the spectrum of opinion is in the Islamic tradition and how much possibility there is. And I think really ultimately in the Islamic tradition The desire is that people are happy, that people are grateful, that people are celebrating the gift of life and not commiserating with each other about being born. So I don't want to see families torn apart. You know, I think the worst thing that can happen to a family is when children become alienated from their parents. We want to see harmonious families, but we also want to see families in which the dignity and integrity of the individuals within that family is also honored. And I think the children have rights. They have a right to live in a dignified environment, to be treated as individuals with feelings, and feelings that should be validated by the parents and not simply rejected or seen as unacceptable because they might not concur with their own feelings. It's very important for parents to allow their children to pursue what is emerging in their personality, because their natural genius will always show up. And if they're allowed, for instance, if they have an aptitude towards mathematics, that should be encouraged. If they have an aptitude towards art, that should be encouraged. Whatever their inclinations are, it's when that kind of God-given gift is beginning to emerge. And for you to force a child who is not inclined towards the mathematics into science and into biology because you want them to be a doctor, it's not really fair when they have a real love for literature and a real inclination for that. And I think that is something that's really been lost in a lot of the Muslim cultures. And I think that part of the genius of the Muslim cultures of the past is that they did recognize that. And then because they allowed people to simply, like a flower, children are very much, they know what to do. We don't really have to tell them. If we actually just let them become who they are, I mean, we give them the guidelines, and we want to inculcate in them morality and decency and discipline and these things, but we also have to recognize that they are unique beings that need to come into their own and to see who they are, to find out who they are, because they are not you.